At Tamzo Muilum in the morning on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima stopped answering. Not slowly, not after a chain of reports, not after the kind of raid that gave officers time to update a map. One moment, a city was still inside the communications grid. The next moment, it was a blank place on the board. In Tokyo, the first problem did not look like the end of a city. It looked like a technical failure. A line down, a relay lost, a district office silent after an American air raid. That was the dangerous part. Because the first form catastrophe took inside the Japanese command system was not a scream, it was paperwork. A clerk could write it down. An officer could route it upward. A general could ask for verification. And once the destruction of Hiroshima entered the system as something that could be filed, it became something the system believed it could manage. This story is not about how the atomic bomb worked. You already know enough about the bomb. This is the story of what happened after the first flash, when the men responsible for ending the war received the facts in pieces, translated them into official language, and made the most expensive delay in modern military history sound procedural. Because between the destruction of Hiroshima and the Emperor's surrender broadcast, there were not empty days. There were reports, there were arguments, there were meetings, there were translations, there were scientific conclusions, there were maps on tables, casualty estimates, surrender terms, and warnings from abroad. The information arrived, action did not. By mid-morning on August 6th, the reports no longer matched a normal air raid. There had been no long formation of bombers, no repeated waves, no hours of incendiaries crawling street by street through wooden neighborhoods. Witnesses on the edges of the city described one aircraft, maybe two, then one flash, then pressure, then heat, then a silence that had weight. People came out of the ruined city with skin hanging from their arms. Others walked without visible wounds, asking for water, then collapsed hours later. Rail lines were twisted. Hospitals were gutted. The Second General Army's command network, the military brain for Western Japan, had been cut apart in a single morning. But inside the ministries in Tokyo, the first instinct was still classification. Was it a new explosive, a fuel-air device, a large conventional raid misreported by shaken survivors, a psychological weapon meant to break morale? That question mattered, but not as much as the army made it matter, because while Tokyo was asking what to call the weapon, Washington had already named it. President Truman's statement was translated and circulated. It said the United States had used an atomic bomb. It warned Japan that refusal to surrender would bring a rain of ruin from the air unlike anything ever seen on Earth. Those words were not whispered, they were broadcast. The Japanese public did not hear them through official newspapers, but shortwave radios could catch the outside world. Diplomats heard them. Foreign ministry officials heard them. Some officers heard them before the army was ready to admit that the enemy's announcement might be more accurate than their own vocabulary. The official Japanese wording stayed smaller. A new type bomb. Considerable damage. Considerable casualties. That was the first surrender of the week. Not surrender to America. Surrender to the comfort of small language. The words did not lie exactly. That made them more useful. A new type bomb had been used. Damage had occurred. Casualties were considerable. Every piece of the sentence was technically able to survive a bureaucratic review. And every piece of it was morally useless, because Hiroshima was not a district with damage. It was a city whose center had been flattened so completely that aerial observers had trouble matching what they saw to the maps they carried. A reconnaissance officer flying over the region did not see the familiar pattern of a firebombed city. Firebombing left scars that still looked like streets. It left zones. It left a logic of spread. Hiroshima looked as though something had pressed the center of the city down with a hot hand. The report that came back was not ambiguous in the way the army wanted it to be. The central destruction was total. Casualties were enormous. Command infrastructure had been shattered. No conventional weapon could explain the visible result. That report reached the command system. It did not immediately break it. This is where the story turns colder. The senior officers were not fools. That is the easier version of history, and it is wrong. War Minister Korechika Anami understood military pressure. He understood morale. He understood what surrender would mean for the army institution that had dominated Japanese politics for years. And he understood the strategy Japan had been preparing for the home islands. Ketsu-Go, the final defense plan. Bleed the invasion. Make the beaches so expensive that the Americans would bargain instead of occupy. Use soldiers, planes, suicide boats, civilians, bamboo spears, anything left, and convert the homeland itself into leverage. That strategy did not require victory. It required cost. And that was why Hiroshima was so dangerous to the army before it was fully understood as a weapon. Because a single bomb that could destroy a city did not merely kill people, it killed the logic of the beach plan. If the Americans could remove a city without landing on the beach, then the beach was no longer the center of the equation. Anami needed time, not because time would bring Hiroshima back, not because time would reduce the dead. He needed time because the institution needed a way to keep its old logic alive inside a new reality. So the army waited for scientific confirmation. Scientists were sent to study burn patterns, blast effects, radiation traces, and witness reports. The process had value. No government should base national surrender on rumor alone. But by August 1945, this was not rumor alone. It was survivor testimony. It was aerial observation. It was the American public statement. It was the disappearance of a major command center. It was the physical fact of a city that no longer functioned. And yet the official posture remained suspended between knowing and admitting. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo saw the same evidence and reached the conclusion the army avoided. The bomb changed the war. The Potsdam Declaration could no longer be treated as another diplomatic document. The government had to move. Togo pushed for emergency deliberation. He pressed Prime Minister Suzuki. He warned that Japan was no longer negotiating from strength, but the army could block with procedure. Wait for confirmation. Do not panic. Do not let one event redefine the whole war. Do not use the enemy's terminology before our experts verify it. These sound like responsible sentences until you place them beside the ruins. Then they become something else. They become the sound a system makes when the truth is already inside the room. But the room refuses to rearrange itself around the truth. On August 8th, the confirmation arrived. The bomb was atomic. That should have ended the argument. It did not. At almost the same moment, another piece of the world moved against Japan. The Soviet Union entered the war. The country Tokyo had hoped might serve as a mediator was now an enemy. The Red Army was moving into Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, once the great symbol of Japanese military power on the Asian continent, was facing the army that had just crushed Nazi Germany. Two pillars collapsed at once. Atomic attack from the air, Soviet attack from the continent. The diplomatic route through Moscow was dead. The beach strategy was dying. The cabinet still could not produce a decision. That was the structure of the disaster. Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, often called the Big Six, was designed to force consensus on the gravest decisions. In normal times, that kind of design can prevent recklessness. In August 1945, it created a machine for deadlock. 3 men leaned toward ending the war. 3 men held out for better terms, more guarantees, or one final use of military leverage. No majority could force the issue. No procedure could break the tie. No city, apparently, could make the room move fast enough. Then the second bomb fell. Nagasaki did not die because Tokyo lacked information. Nagasaki died inside a gap. The gap between confirmation and decision, between reality and wording, between what the leaders knew and what the institution allowed them to do with that knowledge. On August 9th, the men in Tokyo were not debating a single unrepeatable anomaly anymore. They were debating a pattern. Hiroshima was not the exception. Nagasaki proved the rule. The weapon could be used again and again and again. Inside the ruined cities, nobody had the luxury of vocabulary. In Hiroshima, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, wounded himself, made his way toward the communications hospital and found a world no training manual could organize. The wounded did not arrive in familiar categories. Burns appeared on one side of the body as if the sky itself had chosen a direction. People with no obvious injury developed fever, vomiting, bleeding, hair loss. Doctors knew trauma. They knew burns. They knew infection. They did not yet have the medical language or supplies to meet acute radiation sickness at this scale. So they did what people do when the system above them is still arguing. They used cloth. They used water. They used their hands. They counted the living until the living became the dying. That is the cruelty of official delay. It does not pause suffering while the meeting continues. The cabinet room and the hospital ward exist at the same time. In one room, men discuss whether surrender terms preserve the national polity. In another, a doctor watches a patient with no burns begin to die from the inside. Both rooms belong to the same history. Only one of them had power. By the night of August 9th and the early hours of August 10th, the ordinary machinery of government had failed. Togo moved through the last available channel. He went through Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, the man closest to Emperor Hirohito. The emperor had authority that was rarely used directly. The system was built around him, but decisions usually moved around him rather than from him. Now the deadlock had become more dangerous than the precedent. An imperial conference was called beneath the palace. The men gathered with 2 destroyed cities behind them, the Soviets entering the war from the north, and the American invasion still looming from the sea. Anami argued that Japan should continue, not because he did not know the facts, because he believed surrender before testing the homeland defense would throw away the last leverage Japan possessed. Togo argued the opposite. The leverage was gone. The enemy did not need to meet Japan on the beaches if Japan's cities could be struck from the air with 1 aircraft. The room divided again, and then Hirohito spoke. He did not speak like a general. He did not calculate tonnage or beach casualties. He spoke from the center of a national collapse. If the war continued, he believed the Japanese people would suffer past endurance. The state itself might not survive the method chosen to defend it. He accepted surrender on one condition: preservation of the imperial institution. That answer went out through neutral channels: Switzerland, Sweden. The United States answered on August 11th. The emperor could remain, but under the authority of the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Not the preservation the hardliners wanted, not an untouched throne, not a victory hidden inside defeat, a throne under occupation. To the surrender faction it was enough. To the army faction it was one more reason to resist. And this is the part people often miss. Even after the emperor had spoken, even after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion, the institution did not simply obey. Some officers began to imagine disobedience as loyalty. They told themselves the emperor had been misled. They told themselves the recorded surrender message could be stopped. They told themselves that preventing surrender was a higher service than carrying it out. On the night of August 14th, junior officers entered the imperial palace grounds and searched for the recording of the emperor's rescript. Not an enemy base, not a foreign embassy, the palace. They were looking for the voice that would end the war. They did not find it. The recording survived. The coup attempt collapsed. Before dawn, War Minister Anami took his own life. His farewell expressed apology to the emperor. It did not fully unwind the logic that had brought him to that final room. That is what makes him difficult to understand and dangerous to simplify. He was not merely a villain who lacked courage. He had courage, he had discipline, he had devotion. He had all the virtues his institution taught him to value. And those virtues, separated from reality, became part of the failure. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time. The broadcast did not use the blunt word surrender in the way modern ears expect. It spoke of enduring the unendurable. It spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. It spoke in court language, layered and careful, even while announcing the end of a war that had consumed Asia and the Pacific. The language softened the edge. Even at the end, the gap remained, but the war ended. The question is what those 8 days left behind. Not only in the cities, not only in the cemeteries, not only in the bodies of survivors who carried radiation into the rest of their lives. They left behind a case study in institutional failure, because the records show something more disturbing than ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected by information. This was not that. The information arrived. The reports arrived. The scientific confirmation arrived. The Soviet invasion arrived. The second bomb arrived. And each new fact entered a structure that had been designed for another war, another strategy, another moral universe. The structure did not say, "We know nothing." It said, "We cannot let this mean what it plainly means." That is a different kind of failure. It is the failure of a system that protects its own framework after the world has invalidated it. The army had a story about how the war could still be shaped. The bomb shattered that story. So the first reaction was not to change the story. It was to shrink the bomb until the story could temporarily survive. New type bomb, considerable damage, wait for confirmation, maintain the position, discuss the terms, protect the polity, test the beaches, preserve leverage. Each phrase had a job. Each phrase made the next hour easier for the men inside the room. And outside the room, the bill kept growing. By the end of 1945, the deaths tied to Hiroshima were estimated in the tens upon tens of thousands, rising toward and beyond 100,000 depending on the count. Nagasaki added tens of thousands more. Exact numbers remain hard because records burned, families vanished, and radiation did not respect the calendar. But the moral arithmetic is clearer than the casualty tables. By August 8th, Japan's leadership had enough information to understand that the war had changed. By August 9th, the second city proved that the first was not a singular nightmare. By August 10th, only the emperor's direct intervention could break the paralysis. By August 15th, the public finally heard the voice that the coup plotters had tried to silence. 8 days. Not empty days. Not confused days. Not days with no facts. 8 days in which facts moved faster than authority. The most important artifact of those days is not a mushroom cloud photograph. It is the contrast between what was visible and what was sayable. Aerial reports could describe a flattened city. Hospital notes could describe patients dying without wounds. Foreign broadcasts could name the weapon. Scientists could confirm the mechanism. But official language still tried to make the event smaller than the reality. That is the part that survives outside 1945. Every institution under pressure faces the temptation to manage the sentence instead of the disaster, to make the report sound stable, to wait for one more review, to protect the plan because the plan is older than the evidence, to call collapse a disruption, to call failure an incident, to call a dead city considerable damage. And sometimes the most dangerous lie is not a false statement. Sometimes it is a true statement made too small. Hiroshima stopped answering at Tomzo Muilam in the morning. Tokyo eventually heard the dulance. It measured it. It classified it. It discussed it. It waited for confirmation. It found the words it could survive. Nagasaki paid for the hours those words bought, and that is why the record still matters. Because somewhere in the machinery of government, on paper thin enough to survive a fire and precise enough to survive denial, the evidence remains. The city was gone. The leaders knew enough. The language made it manageable, and the delay became history. The bomb destroyed Hiroshima in a morning. The institution made the disaster smaller one sentence at a time.